Kodak suggests a give and take Christmas.
Give Kodak gifts for Christmas. Take pictures, save the fun, and share your Merry Christmas days with everyone. Give Kodak gifts for Christmas. Take all the Christmas cheer to live again, enjoy again, year after year. Give Kodak gifts for Christmas. Take pictures all year through. To give a Kodak gift's the merriest Christmas thing to do.
What if the biggest threat to your billion-dollar empire wasn't a competitor, but an invention that came from your own lab? Well, for Kodak, that wasn't just a hypothetical. In 1975, Kodak invented the digital camera, but then they buried it. This is the story of how the king of photography, a company that basically dominated the 20th century, engineered its own downfall. To understand just how spectacular the fall was, you need to understand the colossal height Kodak fell from. For most of the 20th century, Kodak wasn't just a company, it was a cultural landmark. You may have heard the phrase a Kodak moment. It became a global universal shorthand for a precious, fleeting memory that had to be preserved. Now, this wasn't an accident. It was the result of a brilliant and ruthless business strategy by its founder, George Eastman. Eastman, who started the company back in 1881, was a genius. He wanted to make photography, which was already a messy and very complicated process even for professionals, as convenient as the pencil. His film rolls changed the game. But his real master play was his business model, a strategy we now call razor and blades. But how did that model work for Kodak? Let me explain. Take Kodak's cameras, for example, like the Brownie. Kodak sold their cameras at often a loss, dirt cheap. These were the razors. Kodak wasn't in the business of selling cameras. They were in the business of selling film. This is where we get into the money. The rolls of film, the developing chemicals, the prints. These were high-margin products, and consumers would buy them over and over and over again. Those were the blades. For decades, this model was an unstoppable money printing machine. By the 1970s, Kodak was an unstoppable titan in the industry. In the United States, they controlled an estimated 90% of the film market and 85% of the camera market. The iconic yellow and red logo was everywhere. At the time, Kodak employed over 140,000 people and had a market value of nearly $30 billion, a company whose dominance felt permanent. Its entire identity was tied to photography itself. They were the gatekeepers of our memories. Every birthday, every vacation, every graduation was captured on Kodak film, processed using Kodak chemicals, and you guessed it, printed on Kodak paper. It was a legacy built on chemistry and nostalgia, and it was pouring money into the company's headquarters. The same headquarters where a young engineer was about to create something that would put it all at risk. The year is 1975, and deep inside an electronics research lab at Kodak, a 24-year-old engineer named Steven Sasson gets a very vague assignment. Figure out if a new piece of tech, a charge-coupled device or CCD, could be used for anything. A CCD is a sensor that turns light into an electronic signal. Sasson's job was basically to test whether the sensor could capture an image. So he got to work scavenging parts from around the lab. A lens from an old movie camera, a bunch of random circuits and wires. He used an analog to digital converter, and to store the file, he grabbed the only portable, rewritable medium he could think of, a cassette tape. A year later, he had created a monster. The device was a beast. It weighed nearly 4 kilos or around 8 pounds. It was the size of a toaster. To capture an image, Sasson had to hold it still for 23 seconds while it captured a grainy black and white image with a resolution of 0.01 megapixels. The thing was, if you wanted to see the image that this camera had captured, you had to create an entirely custom rig to do so. Now, this rig would plug into a TV, and then you'd wait around 30 seconds after plugging the cassette in, and all of a sudden, a grainy image would pop up on the screen. Now, the first photo they took this way was of a lab technician. It was fuzzy and very grainy, but it was a proof that there was photography without film. Excited, Sasson and his team brought their new invention to show the executives. They gathered the top brass and did their demonstration of what they had just created. And when the fuzzy picture appeared on the TV, the room fell silent. Sasson looked around, hoping to see excitement and a spark. Instead, he got head scratching. The executives started asking questions like, who wants to look at their photos on a TV? And where's the negative? Kodak's executives saw the invention not as a game changer, but as a toy, a cute gadget. According to Sasson, the general response from management was chillingly pathetic. It was along the lines of, "That's cute, don't tell anyone about it." That sentiment would echo through Kodak for decades. A perfect summary of denial that sealed the company's fate. The people who built an empire on capturing memories were shown the future of how moments would be captured, and they essentially asked its inventor to hide it in the closet. So how does a company that big, that successful, go bankrupt? The answer is complicated. Now, Kodak isn't clueless. They absolutely saw digital coming. In fact, they were investing heavily in digital research throughout this period. The problem was they made a conscious, calculated decision to sideline it, all because of one of the most powerful forces in business: fear. The fear of killing your own wildly profitable business. This is a classic case of what Harvard professor Clayton Christensen later dubbed the inventor's dilemma. It's a trap successful companies fall into when a new disruptive technology is brought up. At first, this new tech is often worse and a lot less profitable and only appeals to a tiny market. And for a giant company like Kodak worth $30 billion, it makes no sense to go and chase a tiny market like that, especially when you already have such a successful business model. So what ends up happening is the company ignores it, or in Kodak's case, it's locked up in an R&D lab. First, there was the fear of destroying their golden goose. Kodak execs weren't dumb. They knew their razor and blade model was everything. They weren't in the camera business. They were in the film, chemical, and paper business. Digital photography didn't just threaten the camera, it threatened to vaporize the entire ecosystem of consumables that generated almost all of Kodak's profits. A digital camera meant no film, no processing, no prints. And for an executive whose bonus was tied to film sales, embracing a filmless future was like a turkey voting for an early Thanksgiving. Second, there was a genuine but very short-sighted belief that film was just better. Honestly, I have to agree with that, but my opinions aside. And in the 80s and 90s, they were right. Sasson's 0.01 megapixel sensor could not compete with 35mm film in quality. Executives argued, not incorrectly, that no serious photographer would ever trade the quality of 35mm for the pixelated mess of digital at the time. What they fatally underestimated was Moore's law, the relentless, exceptional pace of technological improvement. They saw digital for what it was in the 1980s. Not for what it was destined to be in the early 2000s. They missed that for most people, convenience would eventually crush quality. Finally, Kodak was trapped by its own identity. The company's culture was built on its chemistry. They were masters of the chemical emulsions that coated their films, where digital was about electronics, sensors, and software. A completely different universe. Their identity was so wrapped up in being the film photography company that they confused market leadership with permanence. They thought they were so powerful that they could control the pace of change, letting digital simmer on the back burner until they decided it was time. But the future doesn't wait for a quarterly earnings report. While Kodak was busy protecting its film business from its own invention, the rest of the world was moving on. Competitors like Sony and Canon didn't have a golden goose to protect, so they saw digital as a pure opportunity. They poured billions into R&D, rapidly improving the technology. Now, Kodak wasn't totally asleep to the idea of digital. They did eventually jump into the digital space in the 90s and for a few years in the early 2000s. They were actually a top seller in the US, but their strategy was backwards. They saw digital cameras as a tool for their old business model. For them, a digital camera's purpose was to make it easier to, you guessed it, make prints. They began investing heavily into kiosks and online services for printing, convinced that people would use their new digital cameras to create physical prints. They completely missed the real revolution: sharing. The point of digital wasn't just capturing without film, it was sharing them instantly for free. The rise of the internet, email, and social media turned photography from the art of preservation into a form of communication. People weren't just taking photos for the album anymore, they were taking them to share what was happening right now. Kodak was trying to sell printers when the world was falling in love with screens. Perhaps the most powerful contrast to Kodak's failures is its old rival, Fujifilm. Fuji was in the exact same boat as Kodak, a film and camera company facing the digital iceberg. But Fujifilm's response couldn't have been more different. Instead of clinging to the past, Fujifilm's leadership began a painful and radical transformation. They executed a three-part plan. First, squeeze every last cent out of the dying film business to fund the future. Second, restructure to survive the digital transition. And third, and most importantly, diversify into new businesses by leveraging their core skills. Fujifilm executives realized that their decades of research into chemistry, specifically preventing oxidization to stop photos fading, had other applications. It turns out that process is chemically similar to how skin ages. So they pivoted into cosmetics and launched a very successful skincare line. Their expertise in applying thin, precise chemical layers to film was perfect for making optical films for LCD screens. They also moved aggressively into medical imaging and diagnostics. They understood they weren't just a film company, they were a high-tech chemical company. While Kodak was busy clinging to its identity, Fujifilm was reinventing itself. Fuji's diversification worked so well, especially when you look at it today. The camera and photo imaging side of Fujifilm's business is under 20% of the overall business, but the entire company is now worth around 26 billion US dollars. Put that into perspective, a company that's been around for a similar amount of time, like Nikon or Nikon. I don't know, I've had some people complain about the way I say that, so I don't know. Whichever way you like to say it, Nikon, they are only worth around 4.6 billion, about 1/5 of what Fuji's worth. It just shows you how successful Fujifilm's diversification was. By the late 2000s, the game was over. The rise of the smartphone put a good enough camera in everyone's pocket. It was the final nail in the coffin. Apple's iPhone in 2007, Instagram in 2011 made Kodak's print-focused strategy completely irrelevant. Sales collapsed. The company that once employed over 140,000 people began massive rounds of layoffs. Factories in Rochester were shut down, dramatic symbols of the company's own fall. The film business had finally run dry, and the digital businesses Kodak had created were not profitable enough to float the business. Kodak's stock price tanked. In a move that signaled the end of an era, Kodak was dropped from the Dow Jones Industrial Average in 2004. Desperate, Kodak tried suing Apple and others for patent infringement, trying to squeeze a few last dollars out of the revolution that they failed to lead. But it was too little, too late. On January 19th, 2012, Eastman Kodak, the 131-year-old icon of American industry, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The Kodak moment was finally over. So what is Kodak today? After emerging from bankruptcy in 2013, the company is a shadow of its former self. It is a much smaller, leaner operation, focused on commercial printing, chemicals, and advanced materials. In a move that slightly mirrors Fujifilm's strategy, they leveraged their chemical know-how to enter into the pharmaceutical industries and also produce components for batteries and touchscreens. And as you would have noticed, there's been that slight increase in film popularity over the last few years, which has also provided a little bit of a tiny niche income for Kodak again in the film space. But the empire it once was is gone. The story of Kodak is a sobering one and a reminder that no lead is safe, no empire is permanent, and the future waits for no one. Now, what do you think? Do you think Kodak's fall was inevitable? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you like this video, subscribe and hit that like button. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.